everyone, and happy Thursday. So, welcome to another author's conversation with Stories of a Colorful World. I am Vanessa Mitchell, along with Kanika Mobley, and together we are the co-founders of Stories of a Colorful World. And if you're new to us, we are an online children's bookstore, and we focus on carrying children's books that feature BIPOC characters or Black, Indigenous people of color by authors from those same diverse groups. And we are committed to supporting young readers in becoming their bold, brave, and brilliant selves. And by doing that, we think it's super important and believe wholeheartedly that every child deserves to see themselves in the books that they read. So that's why carrying diverse books is super important to us. But we also use our Authors Conversations platform to highlight the authors of these books. And this evening, we are very excited and have the pleasure of introducing Rajani, excuse me, Rajani LaRocca. So welcome and thank you for joining us this evening. And Rajani is the author of Where Three Oceans Meet, among a host of other children's books that we'll get into because she's been quite busy. So we'll talk about that a little bit more and talk about some of your other children's books that you have. But Rajani, thank you again and welcome to our conversation. So maybe I'll just turn it over to you and ask you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are.
Sure. Thanks so much, Vanessa and Kanika. It's so nice to be here with you tonight. So I'm Rajani LaRocca. I was born in India, immigrated to the US when I was a baby, and grew up in Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky. And then now I came to the Boston area for college and never left. So that's where I am now. And, I have to say that I loved books from a very young age. I think I was a pretty early reader and I was kind of obsessed with books. I read everything. I read fiction and I read nonfiction. I read comic books. I read comic strips. I read cereal boxes and receipts when I couldn't have anything else. It was just I was obsessed. And I have to say that, when I was a kid, most of the books, actually all of the books that I read did not have any characters that resembled me in any way. And so that was in the US. And then in India, when I would go there to visit my extended family, we would sometimes go for the whole summer. I would read books there, and those involved Indian people, but in India. So those weren't really me either. And, at the time, there was no choice. So it's not like I knew what I was missing. And I kind of read about all kinds of characters from all kinds of places and loved them all and got interested in them all. But it wasn't until I was much older as an adult that I finally read a story that had something to do with somebody with my experience, somebody from India who was growing up in the US. And at that time, I realized what I'd been missing kind of all my life. And it was a pretty big moment for me. Now, in terms of writing, I used to like to write creatively when I was young. I did it through high school and even in college. But the thing is that I also knew kind of from a pretty early age that I wanted to go into medicine. I really loved kind of biology and I loved the idea of what doctors did. And so I remember one time I was in high school and I was in a creative writing class and I told my teacher, I said, I really love writing, but this is not going to be my career. I know I'm going to go to medical school. And he said to me, who says you have to choose? Mm-hmm. And so he brought in all these books that were written by authors who also happened to be doctors. And at the time, of course, they were all white men, but hey, that's what I had at that point. So it kind of planted a seed in my head. And so, then I went to medical school and residency and I had little kids and there was no writing happening during those years. That was just a lot of work and a lot of stuffing my brain. And then finally, about 10 years ago, I decided to go back to doing something creative that didn't have anything to do with birthday parties. And so I took some classes online and then I met all kinds of writers. And then that was kind of the beginning of the end and the end of the beginning, because I kept writing. Once you have friends that are writers, you keep writing. And eventually I got an agent and we sold a bunch of books. And because I kind of like to read a variety of things, I also write a variety of things. I write fiction and nonfiction. I write picture books in middle grade, and I write in poetry and prose. So yeah, and it's been a whirlwind since a few years ago. In 2019, my first book came out, my first middle grade, called Midsummer's Mayhem, which can be described as an Indian American take on A Midsummer Night's Dream meets Cupcake Wars. And then last year, my first picture book came out, Seven Golden Rings. It's set in ancient India, and it involves a math puzzle and an explanation of binary numbers. And then this year, I had 6 books come out. So 2 middle grade novels and 4 picture books, and I couldn't be happier. And I'm just thrilled.
You have been very busy. Extremely busy. What was it about, you could have written anything. So what was it about writing children's books that particularly appealed to you?
Yeah, so I think one answer is that maybe my brain is stuck at age like 12 or 13. And that's kind of like where my feelings lie. But I think the other answer is that when I thought back on the books that meant the most to me, the ones that made the biggest difference in my life, they were all ones that I read when I was a kid. And I am still a huge reader. I love books, and I've loved and been affected by books as an adult, but I really do think that those books that you read when you're a child are the big ones.
So a doctor and an author. So
Yes.
you talked about the math problems and so forth, but how does being a doctor show up in your books, or does it show up in your books? Does it?
Oh, it definitely does. So so as you mentioned, I love math and I love science. So there's a lot of math and science in my books. I think that, so it's interesting. People have asked me this question before, and I think there's a lot that is similar about being a doctor and being a writer. I think you have to work on observation skills.
Mm-hmm.
You have to learn how to listen to people. And ultimately, I think the most important thing about both of these careers is that you have to love people. Mm-hmm. And that's what it's all about. Like, as a doctor, you have to love people and try to help them the way that they need to be helped at the moment, right? And as a writer, you have to love people and kind of be fascinated by them. And because I think that's what writers do, we kind of write stories that are all reflections of what it is to be human. Right. So so that's, and then specifically, I put math and science in my books. So I have several books that involve math, including my middle grade book, Much Ado About Baseball, which is about a couple of math competition rivals who end up on the same summer baseball team, and they have all kinds of magical, strange things happen to them. But there's a lot of math at the heart of it, and they are awesome at it, and they love it. And they're math puzzles, so it's not just like straight math. Right. So I hope that kids find them entertaining as well as interesting. And then my other, my first middle grade novel of 2021, Red, White, and Whole, which is written in verse, has a lot of biology in it. So it's about a 13-year-old girl who feels, and it's set in 1983, so it's got all that awesome 80s music in it too. About a 13-year-old girl who feels torn between the worlds of her Indian immigrant parents and her kind of friends at school and kind of 80s pop culture. And, she wants to be like other teenagers and wear cool clothes and go to a dance, but her parents, and especially her mother, feel that she has better things to do with her time. But then her mom is diagnosed with a kind of blood cancer called leukemia, and she feels like her world's turned upside down. And she thinks that if she could just be the perfect daughter, the daughter that her parents want her to be, that she can somehow save her mother's life. So there's actually, in poetry, a lot of discussion about what is blood, the components of blood, what is leukemia, like how is it treated, all that kind of stuff. And actually the title, Red, White, and Whole, refers to the components of blood, red cells and white cells and whole blood.
Oh, interesting.
And also I have another science picture book, my first nonfiction science book that came out, picture book that came out, is The Secret Code Inside You, which explains DNA to young readers and also talks about kind of the limits of genetics and how our choices also make us who we are. So lots of math and science in all my books.
Love that.
Definitely. You can see it intertwined in so many of your books, but it also feels like accessible to kids too, right? Because it's not like, even with Bracelets for Venus Brothers, right? It's not math per se, but it's telling this story and math is intertwined into it.
Yes, I
And
hope
so
so.
is that into, like, do you go into the projects intentionally thinking about it in that way?
Um, you mean about whether I'm going to include STEM elements or things like that?
Yes.
Yes. So with Bina, I definitely went into it thinking I was going to make it was going to be a STEM book, because Charles Bridge actually, had a call for authors to write stories that involved math for young kids, like really young kids, and that also involved kind of diversity. And so I they had a symposium where they kind of we talked about early math, and pattern making was one of the things that came up. And I was like, oh, patterns, like that's so cool. And for some reason, my mind jumped from patterns to bracelets, like beaded bracelets. And then I was
Right.
like, that's it. There's a holiday. It's a holiday about bracelets. How awesome is that? So yeah, that was intentional. And then Seven Golden Rings started from a logic puzzle that I had heard from my uncle when I was a kid. And I kind of created characters and created a whole story around the logic puzzle. Yeah, but I think that, so I think I approach math and science from a place of wonder. Like, I think that these things are marvelous and kind of really cool. So I think I think that kids should think they're really cool too, because that's how I feel about them. And so I hope my enthusiasm comes across in the stories that I write.
Absolutely.
So for Where Three Oceans Meet, right? I was reading a review, and I read the book, but didn't even think about it until I read the review. But they were talking about the significance of three. And you started talking about a little bit about the significance of three. And so maybe the first question is, what is the significance of the title? And how does three show up, and why is the number three? Because you talk about including numbers and math and so forth in the books. Why is that important?
Oh, it's that's such an interesting question. So, this book was inspired by a trip that I took with my own family when I was a kid to a place called Kanyakumari at the very tip of the southern tip of India. And that's where people say three oceans meet. And it's the Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal, and the Arabian Sea. And I remembered going out there, and you can see three different colors of water. And I was like, is this like imaginary or not? Because, who knows, right? But it's a beautiful place, as you can imagine. And I thought about that trip, and I thought about the things that were most important to me on that trip. Now, in the story, it's a little girl named Sejal who goes with her mother and grandmother to Kanyakumari. And basically, the idea is that they all start off at the beginning of the story wanting kind of different things from this trip. And Sejal really wants to go to the end of the earth, which is what she thinks of this place as. And her mom wants to see friends, and her, grandmother wants to visit temples. And so they all kind of start off differently, and they have different clothes, and they like their food in a different way. But when I think back on that trip that I took with more than just my mom and my grandma, but I remember the times with them really distinctly, it was not only about kind of the big sights that you expect to see on a sightseeing trip. It was really about those little moments of kind of tenderness that you have with those you love on a trip like this. And those were the moments that I wanted to capture in this story. So this was a story that I got this idea, and I like wrote it, and it like poured out of me, and I revised it really quickly. And it occurred to me that because they were going to see three oceans, and there were three characters in this story, it occurred to me that the echoes of what three means kind of happened over and over again. And then in the story, there's also a metaphor of a braid, right? Which is most commonly with three strands of hair, and how, as a kid, you realize that like a thick stack of papers is much harder to rip than a single paper. And, like a rope that is woven is much harder to tear than a single strand. that's what a braid is like too. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, that's what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that three of these characters are stronger together than each of them is alone. Because in the middle of this story, they think about how they spend so much time apart because Sejal and her mom live in the US and the grandmother still lives in India. But when they're together, they're strong. And even when they are apart, they still have those bonds that connect them.
I love that. That is so beautiful.
Thank you.
And it definitely comes across even in the illustrations. And I know your illustrator lives in India. So how did the two of you connect to put this together so beautifully?
Oh my goodness. So the illustrator's name is Archana Srinivasan. She lives in India. She's so talented. She illustrates so many different kinds of things, and her style is different for each one. So she illustrated my first picture book, 7 Golden Rings, and her style is totally different for that than it is for this one. And we connected because my editor at Abrams said, I think this is the person that needs to illustrate your book. And I was like, I think I agree, because her work is amazing. And what I will say is that I felt very fortunate because they reached out to her and she read the story and she said that she connected strongly with the story as well, because it's about mothers and daughters, and she thought about her own grandmother. And the way that she depicts the grandmother in the book is her grandmother. And oh my goodness. So like, it gives me the chills thinking about it. And like all the little details of the house where they are, the kind of clothes that the grandmother wears, all from her own life, her own grandmother. So it was super special. And I mean, honestly, we authors get to see sketches of their picture books before they kind of go forward and see if we have any feedback or anything. And all I could say was, wow. Like, oh my goodness. Like, it was incredible and so heartwarming. And yeah. And then, I think the thing that my editor said when we were thinking about Archana was that she said that she feels like the fourth character in this story is India. And so she wanted somebody who was very familiar with South India in particular, which is where the story takes place, to be the illustrator. And she was right.
She did a great job.
Absolutely.
It so vividly matches your words, right? The illustrations are beautiful, and they highlight, I mean, the story itself too, and the images highlight the beauty of India and the culture of India. So the food, you talk about the food and the clothing and the markets and the sites. But why was that so important to you? And I know that's your heritage. So why was it important to bring that into your book?
Here's the thing. If you had asked me when I was a kid, first of all, A, that I would grow up to be a writer, B, that I would write about stuff from my own childhood and like my own kind of upbringing, I would have said that you're crazy. Because, no, I want to write about like fantastical things and this and that and kind of the white world that I grew up in, right? But when I started writing, I wrote about the things that meant the most to me, that I cared the most about. And so these are the kinds of stories that came out of me. And I think that sometimes as a person of color, you have to rethink your own attitudes toward things about what kinds of stories are worth telling and who's going to be interested. When I write stories about like my own experience with my own family and our traditions, I always thought of them as little stories. I always thought of them as like, this is just about me and my family and I don't know who else is going to be interested. But I think what's amazing and heartening and wonderful is that when you talk about real details and real emotions that you've experienced in your own life, those kinds of stories become universal. So people may not have been to India, people may not have visited these places, or worried about having relatives in a different country, but everyone knows what it is to love someone and not be able to be with them all the time. And everyone knows what it is to have relatives who love you and take care of you and go on adventures with you. So yeah, that's why I realized that writing about things that I really care about translates into stories that other people want to read.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And the authenticity of it, I think, pours through, and that's what people really connect to.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Some of those scenes were really lifted from my own experience. It's pretty wild.
So you also, almost within a week, had 2 books come out at the same time this year. So we grew up on like the little golden books. And how did working on the Kamala Harris book come about?
Oh my goodness, it was like a dream come true. So the publisher actually approached me, and contacted my agent and said, would she be interested in writing this, little golden book biography of Kamala Harris? And I was like, what? Would I? So that was really amazing. But then they also said, okay, well, can you have a draft to us in like a month?
Oh, wow.
And I was like, wait, what?
Wow.
But you know what? I honestly believe that you should say yes to like things that are exciting, but also scary. So I was like, fine, I've never written a biography before. That's fine. I'll do it. But they were really helpful. They gave me some examples of other books. So I knew how long it was supposed to be. I kind of knew, of course, I knew where it was going to end up, thank goodness. And so it was really fun to kind of figure out what kind of aspects of Kamala Harris's life I wanted to focus on. And I knew I wanted to start with her being a kid because I think it's really easy for kids to relate to what it was like growing up as Kamala. And, and she had just an incredible set of parents and, just a wonderful relationship with her sister. And, she knew who she was from the very beginning, which is just so incredible, right? She just had a great activist background. Both her parents were activists. And I just thought that was fascinating. That was the through line through everything. And she's also a really fun person. Like she just likes lots of things that people can relate to, right? Like, dancing and singing and cooking and, Chuck Taylor tennis shoes. So it's like, it's awesome. And of course, how could we resist the fact that her stepchildren call her Mamala? I think that's just the cutest thing ever.
I love it.
It was incredible. And then they got an amazing illustrator for that too. And she just did a fantastic job in next to no time. And it was a ball.
And how does one manage being a doctor and a wife and writing a book in a month? Like how does one manage doing all that?
Well, my children are older now. So they're both in college now. So that's definitely helpful. But I think the simple answer to that is that, and you all know this, right? You're both, you have full-time jobs and you're doing this new venture, right? Mm-hmm. When you love something, when you are passionate about it, you find the time for it, right? Because in many ways, I'm not saying that it's not work, because I know it's work, all of it's work, right? Right. It doesn't feel like a burden, even though it's hard work, because you love it and you care about it. So, I think it's a combination of passion, because I'm like, so, when I get into a story, I'm so into it. I'm like, come on, let's go. It's a combination of that plus, kind of the things that help you in like your, the rest of the world. Like going into medicine, you kind of have to like set goals and study for exams and like get stuff done on time and respond quickly. So I think all of those skills help. But then you get to channel it into something you're absolutely crazy passionate about.
Yeah.
I love that.
I admire you. I really do.
Well, I admire you. So here we are. It's the Mutual Admiration Society. Yeah.
I love that. What advice would you give to, say, aspiring writers?
So I will say that if you like to write, you're a writer. And that means you should write. Mm-hmm. I think it's very easy to kind of fall into the trap of like thinking about writing or planning to write or like taking lots of classes. But you know what? Like, and I think all of those things are good. Thinking and planning and taking classes and connecting with other people, that's all important. But you have to also write. And I would just say, write the best book or books that you can. That is the number one thing. The rest of it will come later. If you write something that's really awesome, then all the publishing part of it, like with agents and editors and all that kind of stuff, that will happen. But first, just write. And I also think that being connected to other writers is something that helped me as I was going along.
So this is still like fairly new. I guess 2019 wasn't that long ago since you started as an author. So were there any challenges, or what was the big, or were there any challenges, or was there a biggest challenge in the journey during this time?
So here's the thing. I didn't have, I will just say this as humbly as I can, I didn't get a lot of rejections in my life before I started writing. Okay, I was a pretty good student. Like I met my husband very early in my life. And so, I was pretty successful, right? And then, in order to, like, if you're a writer, if you want to be an author, you want to be published, you have to like put your work out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I gotta tell you, I got told no so many times. And it just gets to the point after a while where you're like, does anybody ever want to read what I have to say? Like I just, it can be disconcerting and rough. But my attitude was, if I don't put things out there, no one will even have the chance to reject me. And no one will also have the chance to say yes. So I was just like, you know what? I'm just going to ignore that it like is painful when I get rejected and just go for it and just like send it out there. And also like work on the things that will, help me. So I tried to learn how to write, and I tried to learn how to craft stories as well as I could. And I kept sending stuff out, and I kept getting told no, until suddenly I started getting told maybe. And then eventually I got to yes. And then I got to a lot of yeses, and that's like a whole other thing. But I think it's hard, especially as adults.
Yeah.
We're like, really, you're gonna say no, and really. But you know what? I've also, because I was older when I came to this, I feel like I have a little bit more context in that when you go into a bookstore or when you shop online at your bookstore, not every book is for every single person. And
Yep.
that's okay. That's okay. The key is, when you're trying to get published, is to find the people who truly love your stories.
Yep.
And then they're going to be incredible advocates for your work as well. And then ultimately those stories are going to find their way to the readers who really need them. So that's the hardest part, is and I still get rejected all the time. And sometimes it is really a bummer. And you're like, seriously? But ultimately, you don't want somebody who feels ambivalent or kind of, about your story to have anything to do with your story. You don't want them representing you, and you don't want them publishing your book if they don't really love it. You want the people who really, really, really love your book to publish it.
I love what you said, right? Because Kanika and I talk about this all the time. Find your tribe. It is okay to find your tribe, right? Everybody's not going, I mean, for our bookstore, everyone's not going to love it. We know that it's important, and we have found a community and a tribe that supports it. So that keeps you going. So I totally agree with that. So on the flip side, so we talked about the challenges. What's been the biggest joy in the journey?
Oh, okay. The biggest joy, and this is the part that like I never thought about really when I was first writing stuff. I was like, okay, I'm interested in this story. I think it's a middle grade. I think it's a picture book. I'm going to write this, blah, blah, blah. You get the agent, you sell it. The book comes out. Like, that's an incredible moment of joy where you hold your finished book. This used to be a Word document, right? It's like, oh my goodness. So that's the first moment of joy. But let me tell you, it doesn't even compare to when a kid comes up to you and is like, I read your book, I love it. Or there's somebody who looks like me on the cover of your book. Or school visits where they're like, you read those books when you were a kid? I read those books too. That is the craziest part, and the most like joyful thing is that children read these books, and every once in a while you get to interact with those children, and it's just mind-blowing. It's so incredible.
Oh my goodness. Yes, that is definitely something that Vanessa and I talk about all the time, especially when we do in-person events. Like, it's one thing to come online and to buy books, but like to see them in person and to see kids get excited about the books, it is incredible.
It really is.
So one thing that we always ask authors is, what does diverse representation in children's books mean to you?
So I told you about Red, White, and Whole, where there's a lot of 80s references in that book, and there are actually a lot of 80s songs in that book. And one of the phrases when I sign that book, the phrase that I use is, "We belong." I think that's, in that book, there's a girl who is struggling to figure out where she belongs, right? She doesn't know it, she doesn't really belong in India, and she sometimes doesn't feel like she belongs in the US, and she doesn't feel like anybody completely understands all the things that are going through her head at any moment in time. But ultimately, she realizes, and this is what we realize as adults if we're lucky, is that we get to choose where we belong, right? That it's up to us, that we find the people who give us strength and give us joy and don't tear us down. And so that's what it means to me, is that first of all, we exist, all of us, and that we have every right to tell our stories just as much as anyone else, that other people can enjoy, other people who are not like us necessarily in some ways can enjoy and appreciate and learn from our stories. But that ultimately all of us choose where we belong, and that part of what we're trying to do as human beings on this planet is create a place where everyone feels welcome and everyone feels heard and seen and understood.
Yeah, there's a place for each and every one of us. We always joke, and it's not in the corner of the bookstore.
That's true. It's right out there in front.
Out in the front with everybody else. We're not in the corner of a bookstore. So I think that's fantastic. And I know you have a couple more projects coming out, because clearly you're not busy enough. Right. The train going.
I have 2 books coming in 2022. A picture book with Candlewick called I'll Go and Come Back, which is about a girl who goes to visit her relatives in India and feels homesick and lonely, and her grandmother helps her out by playing with her and reading with her and cooking food and eating with her. And then the grandmother comes to the US to visit the girl and feels lonely and homesick, and the girl helps her. And that phrase, the title, I'll Go and Come Back, has to do with a phrase in Tamil, and actually many other Indian languages, in which we don't ever say goodbye. We say, I'll go and come back. So there's always the promise of return. That's coming out in March. And then next fall is my next middle grade novel, also with HarperCollins, like Red, White, and Whole. And it is in verse, and it's called Switch. And it's about twin sisters who are musical, but one of them has a secret, and they grow apart. And so they have a dare where they go to their music camp and they have to switch places. So looking like the other one and playing the kind of music that the other one plays. And the one who lasts the longest without being discovered gets to decide something very important. So yeah, I'm excited about that one too. And then I've got more in 2023. I've got a bunch of picture books and other things coming in 2023. So it's exciting.
I love it. And we are definitely anticipating reading those when they come out. They sound very exciting. So how can